It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 29 at the time, burned out from work and tired of being stuck inside all the time. I lived in a small apartment in Minneapolis back then, working full-time as a web developer. Long days in front of a screen had started to mess with my head, and I needed a real break, not just a weekend trip. I wanted to disappear somewhere quiet for a while, away from phones and traffic and people. My mom's older brother, Uncle Ray, had a farm property in northern Iowa, out near the Minnesota border. He hadn't worked it in years, not since his health started to decline, but he still owned it. There was an old wooden cabin on a far corner of the land that used to be for workers during harvest season. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and ran on a gas generator for power. It sat at the edge of a long, overgrown field and backed into a line of thin trees. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. Just land, silence, and a lot of space. I asked if I could stay there for a couple weeks. Uncle Ray said yes and mailed me a key, telling me to be careful because the place hadn't been used in a long time. I packed some basic supplies: canned food, water, camping stove, a cooler with dry ice, and a couple of old hunting knives I had in storage. I also brought my dog, a 6-year-old yellow lab named Cody. I left on a Monday morning and got there by mid-afternoon. The drive was about 4 hours. Once I passed the last stretch of road, it turned into dirt. The farm was tucked way back, behind rusted wire fences and empty pastures filled with tall weeds. I parked near the gate and walked the last quarter mile to the cabin. It was hot that day, probably mid-80s. The air smelled like soil and dried grass. Everything looked still. I didn't see a single car or hear anything but insects buzzing in the heat. The cabin sat under some shade, its boards sun-bleached and its roof sagging in the middle. A couple of the front steps were cracked, but it felt stable enough. When I unlocked the door, the hinges creaked, and the smell of dust and old wood rushed out like something that had been sealed too long. The inside was plain: one small room with a cot, a wood stove, a table, and a couple of broken chairs. In the back was a tiny bathroom that didn't work anymore. There was an old water pump outside, so I figured I'd be fine for washing and basic stuff. For a guy who just wanted to disappear for a while, it was perfect. The first 3 days were peaceful. I spent my time walking through the fields, cleaning up the cabin, and sitting on the porch with Cody. I brought books to read and a notebook to write in. I didn't think much about anything. I'd eat, sleep, stretch, and watch the sun crawl across the sky. The nights were silent except for crickets and the wind. I'd keep the lantern off after dark and sit with a flashlight, just listening to the quiet. I hadn't felt that calm in years. On the 4th day, I decided to explore more of the land. Uncle Ray's farm was big, over 200 acres, but the cabin sat far from the barn and the house near the front. The rest of the land was mostly flat, with a few tree lines and dried-out ditches. There was a grain silo not far from the cabin, completely empty, just standing there like a dead tower. I walked out past it and saw an old path cut through the grass, almost hidden now. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. It led toward a patch of trees in the distance, maybe half a mile away. Out of curiosity, I followed it. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The path seemed clearer the farther I went. The grass looked pressed down in some places, like someone had walked it recently. But the dirt didn't show footprints. It was too dry and hard. Still, it felt like a trail someone was maintaining. I got to the trees and saw a clearing beyond them, about the size of a small yard, surrounded by thick brush. In the middle of that clearing was a small structure. It looked like a shed, maybe 10 feet by 10, built from mismatched boards and metal. It was tilted slightly, as if the ground under it had shifted. The door was made from plywood and had a sliding bolt on the outside. There were no windows. I didn't go inside that day. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to ruin the peace I'd been enjoying. Maybe it just felt wrong. I stood there for a few minutes, looked around, then turned back. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Cody kept shifting near the foot of the cot, restless, ears flicking. I kept thinking about that shed. Why build something so deep into the property, far from the house or barn? Why seal it up with a bolt? The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. The next morning, I walked back to the clearing. It was hotter than the day before. The path felt even more visible now, like it had been used again. I started to think maybe animals were moving through it, or some kids had been sneaking around. But no one lived nearby. This land was private, isolated. It didn't add up. When I reached the shed again, I noticed something new. There were fresh scratches near the lock, long ones almost parallel. Not deep, but enough to look recent, like someone tried to pry the door open or had used a tool near it. The bolt itself looked fine, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I stood there for a while, then decided to open it. I slid the bolt and pulled the door slowly. Creaked loud, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth. The inside was dim, but the light from behind me spilled in enough to see. The first thing I noticed was the smell, strong, like rust and old meat. The air felt stale, like it hadn't moved in years. Inside, there was a table against the wall, a chair, and what looked like a large wooden box, maybe a crate. There were ropes hanging from nails, stained in places. The table had metal tools on it, pliers, screwdrivers, a saw, a knife. The blade was still shiny. The wood of the table was scratched and dark in spots. On the floor, there were marks, like drag marks, lines and smears in the dust. Some of them trailed into the corner where a small trapdoor sat. It was about 3 feet wide, square, and looked like it opened into the ground. A metal ring was attached to the top for lifting. I didn't open it. I stepped back, heart pounding. Every hair on my arms stood up. My body felt stiff, like my brain was trying to stop me from moving forward. I closed the door and rebolted it. Walked away fast. Back at the cabin, I sat outside with Cody for hours, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a leftover hunting spot. Maybe Uncle Ray had used it to store equipment and animals got in. Maybe some dumb teenager years ago tried to make it a hideout. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I'd seen the condition of that place, the freshness of those marks, the metal tools that didn't have a speck of rust. Someone had been there recently, and that meant someone might still be coming back. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the window with a flashlight off, listening. Cody stayed close, breathing heavy, ears raised. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, a snapping sound, a soft crunch. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. Then a bird screamed in the distance, sharp and short. I stayed like that until the sun came up. The next day, I thought about leaving. I packed some of my stuff and walked it back to the truck. I even started the engine, but I didn't drive away. I don't know if it was curiosity or some kind of stupid pride, but I decided to stay one more night, just one. I wanted to see if anyone came back to that shed. I made a plan. That evening, I took Cody and went back to the clearing. I didn't go near the shed this time. Instead, I climbed a tree about 30 feet away and settled in with a thermos and a pair of binoculars. I stayed still as the sun went down. It got cold fast. The sky went from orange to black, and the woods went quiet. No wind, no bugs, just silence. Cody lay under the tree, hidden in tall grass. He didn't make a sound. I waited. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement. A figure came out of the trees opposite where I was. Slow steps, careful. A man, I think. He was wearing a heavy coat and a cap. He walked up to the shed, looked around, then unlocked it, went inside. He was in there for over an hour. No light came out. I heard nothing. Then he came out, locked it again, and walked off the same way he came. I waited another hour, then climbed down. I didn't go to the shed. I went straight back to the cabin, shaking. The next morning, I packed everything, loaded Cody into the truck, and left without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the freeway. I called Uncle Ray when I got home and asked him about that shed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Don't go poking around that far side of the property. That's all." I didn't ask again. A month later, I saw something in a local paper, a small article. Authorities had raided a property in northern Iowa after a tip. They found evidence of illegal trapping, possibly something worse. No charges were filed, but the place was under investigation. They didn't list the exact location, but the photo in the article showed a structure I recognized. A tilted little shed made from mismatched boards and metal, sitting alone in a field. I never went back. To this day, I don't know what was under that trapdoor, but I know I was never supposed to see that place, and I'm glad I didn't stay one more night. My name is Daniel Mercer. This happened in the fall of 2016 in rural West Virginia, just a few miles from the old state line near the Monongahela Forest. I was 32 at the time and worked as a freelance surveyor. My job usually had me hiking through unmarked land, marking boundaries for private clients, usually property that no one had touched in decades. Most of the time, it was peaceful. Long hikes through old timber, hills, valleys, streams. The pay wasn't always great, but I liked being alone. I didn't mind the quiet. I'd bring a tent and a pack and stay out for a few nights at a time. I had my gear, a good rifle, and I knew how to handle myself in the woods. This job started like any other. A guy from Georgia had recently bought an old parcel up north, a huge chunk of forested land that hadn't been registered since the 1960s. No one had done anything with it in years. The property included a long-abandoned graveyard and, apparently, a small hunting cabin that hadn't been used since the 70s. My job was simple: hike in, flag the boundary lines, check on the cabin, and send back GPS coordinates and pictures. It was supposed to be a 3-day trip, maybe 4 if the weather turned. I packed light, just the usual: tent, tarp, camp stove, some dried food, satellite phone, my Winchester 70, and a water filter. I parked my truck about 4 miles from the boundary line, at the end of an old logging road that had been mostly overtaken by weeds and saplings. From there, I followed a faint ATV path that disappeared after about a mile. The hike in was long but quiet. Leaves were already turning. The air had that cool bite to it, and the only sound was wind and the crunch of old leaves under my boots. By mid-afternoon, I reached the graveyard. I hadn't planned on stopping there first, but the path brought me right past it. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 30-40 headstones, most of them leaning or cracked. A rusted iron fence ran around it, half collapsed on one side. The names were mostly unreadable, just smooth gray stone with dates from the 1800s. No fresh graves, of course. It had that forgotten look, like no one had been buried there in over 100 years. The place was shaded by oaks and thick pines, and the ground was soft with moss and dead needles. I didn't linger. I flagged the corner nearest the graveyard, marked the coordinates, and moved on. The cabin sat another mile past the graveyard, tucked away on a low ridge just above a dried-up creek. I found it late in the day, when the sun had started sinking. It wasn't much, just a single-room log cabin, maybe 12 by 15 feet, with a rotting tin roof and a warped door that hung crooked on its hinges. One side of the place had started to collapse, and I could see daylight through the planks inside. But it still stood. I snapped a few pictures, made some notes, and decided to camp there for the night. I didn't sleep inside the cabin. It smelled bad. Damp, old wood, rodent droppings, and something else I couldn't place. I pitched my tent a few yards away, closer to the tree line. built a fire, heated a meal, sat for a while just listening. The woods were quiet that night. No owls, no wind, no rustling in the leaves. Just that dead kind of silence that sometimes settles in places like that. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd spent enough nights in the wild to know the silence didn't always mean something was wrong. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not from a sound exactly, more from a feeling like something had shifted around me. You know how sometimes you snap awake like your body senses something before your brain does? It was like that. I stayed still, listening. The fire had burned down, and it was pitch dark outside. I didn't hear anything at first. No footsteps, no breaking twigs, just that same silence. But the feeling stayed. I waited a long time. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but it was light and broken. I got up early the next morning, made coffee, and planned to finish flagging the rest of the boundary by mid-afternoon. I left most of my gear at camp and set out with just my day pack, GPS, rifle, and some snacks. I spent the day walking the perimeter, marking trees, taking notes. The property was bigger than I thought. Dense forest, deep hollows, rocky ridges. At one point, I found the remains of an old barbed wire fence, half buried under moss and leaves. Looked like no one had touched it in decades. I flagged it anyway. I didn't get back to camp until just before dark. That's when I noticed something small but strange. My tent flap was open. I always zip it shut, habit, even if I'm just stepping away for water. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe I'd left it unzipped in the morning rush. But then I noticed something else. My stove had been moved. Not far, just rotated slightly, like someone had picked it up and set it down again. I checked inside the tent. Nothing was missing, but my sleeping bag looked like it had been unrolled and rolled again, sloppily. My water bottle had been uncapped and was lying on its side. It looked like someone had been there. I looked around the trees, the ground, the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched. That same heaviness from the night before was back. I didn't want to stay another night. I debated packing up and heading out even though it was late. But I knew the trail wasn't safe in the dark. Too rocky, too easy to twist an ankle or lose my bearings. I decided to stay, but this time I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, with my back to a tree, rifle across my lap, watching the cabin and the woods. Hours passed. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard something. Footsteps, slow, careful ones, from the direction of the graveyard. They weren't heavy, not like boots. They were light, careful, someone trying to move without making noise. But in the dead silence, even careful steps made sound. They came closer, then stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I felt them, like whoever it was had stopped just beyond my line of sight. Maybe behind one of the trees, maybe watching me. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, breathing as slow as I could. After a while, the steps moved again, this time toward the cabin. I heard the creak of the old floorboards, faint but clear, then nothing. I stayed like that until dawn, frozen, tense. When it got light, I finally stood and checked the cabin. The door was slightly more open than before. Inside, something had been moved. There was an old wooden chair in the corner that had been facing the wall the day before. Now it was turned around, facing the door. That's when I decided to leave. I packed fast. I didn't stop to eat or make coffee. I just threw everything into my pack and got moving. The whole way back, I kept checking behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I never shook the feeling that I was being followed. Once, maybe halfway to the truck, I found a fresh footprint in the soft mud by the stream. Too small to be mine. Not a boot, more like an old sneaker or worn shoe. No tread. I made it back to my truck by late morning, loaded my gear, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. Back home, I filed the report. I told the landowner the cabin was still standing, but the area looked unstable. I left out the rest, the strange silence, the open tent, the footsteps, the feeling. What would I even say? Weeks passed. I kept working, other jobs, other forests, but that trip stayed with me. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd wake up thinking someone was in the room. I kept my bedroom door locked, bought security cameras, started double-checking windows. Then, one day in December, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a manila envelope. No letter, no message. Just a single photograph. It was a picture of me, sitting by my campfire the first night near that cabin. Taken from the woods, from behind a tree. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. The firelight, my backpack beside me, the outline of the cabin in the background. Someone had been there, someone close enough to see me, to photograph me, to watch me and then leave without a trace. I gave the picture to the local sheriff, filed a report. Nothing ever came of it. That was the last time I took a job like that. I quit surveying the next spring and took a position at a warehouse just outside Morgantown. Safer, boring, regular hours. I haven't spent a night in the woods since. I still hike sometimes during the day on marked trails, but every now and then, I'll catch myself looking over my shoulder, listening for soft footsteps in the quiet. And every time I close my tent in my mind, I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that first night? What would have happened if I'd stayed another? I don't want to know. I never thought I'd go back to that place again. Not after everything that happened between me and Julia. We had bought the cabin during the second year of our marriage, back in 2003. It was up in a quiet corner of Vermont, near a small town called Granville. It wasn't anything special, just a two-room wooden place with a tiny porch and an old wood stove, but it had meant something once. We spent a few winters there, drinking cheap wine by the fire, reading old books, sometimes going out to the frozen lake nearby. That was before the fights, before the silence, and long before the divorce. She passed away last fall. Ovarian cancer. It happened faster than anyone thought it would. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 6 years. The news came in an email from her sister. I didn't cry. I just stared at the screen for a while, then went outside and sat on the porch in the cold for a long time. I didn't feel anything until a few days later when I found myself looking through a box of old things from our marriage. Letters, photos, a flannel shirt that still smelled a bit like her perfume. Then it hit me like a truck. After she passed, the cabin technically became mine again. She had no kids. I had no plans. The lawyers sent me a bunch of paperwork. I ignored it for weeks. Then, in early February, something made me sign it all and drive up there. I told myself I was just going to clean the place up. Maybe sell it, maybe just lock the door and never come back. I loaded up the truck with basic supplies, flashlight, sleeping bag, canned food, tools. I brought my dog Cooper with me. He's a 3-year-old chocolate lab with more energy than sense, but he's good company and better protection than most alarms. We left early in the morning on a Wednesday. The drive took most of the day. It started snowing lightly as we reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. I had to park about 100 yards away since the snow was too thick and the road hadn't been plowed in weeks. I walked the rest of the way, hauling my pack while Cooper bounded ahead through the powder like a deer. The cabin looked exactly the same. The porch sagged a little more. One of the shutters had come loose, but the smell when I opened the door hit me instantly. Dust, pine, old smoke, and something else. Something stale. I set my gear down, opened a few windows, and lit a fire in the stove. Took a while, but the place warmed up. That night, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the old bed and laid there for hours, staring at the ceiling beams. Cooper slept curled up by the door. Every creak of the walls, every shifting gust of wind outside, pulled my eyes open again. I kept seeing Julia's face in the corners of my mind, not like a ghost or anything, just memories. Her sitting by the fire reading a paperback, her laughing with her hair pulled back in a bandana, her screaming during one of our last fights. It all came back hard in the dark. The next morning, I got up early, made coffee on a propane burner, and tried to stay busy. I cleaned the place up a little, cleared out the pantry, threw away a nest of mouse-eaten blankets. There was a lot more damage than I expected. Something had been inside, not just mice, something bigger. There were deep scratch marks on the inside of the front door, not fresh, but wide and long. Some of the food cans were dented like they'd been hit with something. The back window had a crack running from top to bottom, and there were strange marks in the snow outside, almost like boot prints, but wrong. Too wide, too heavy. I chalked it up to some idiot breaking in months ago. Probably someone local, maybe a hunter or someone looking for shelter. Still, it put me on edge. That night, I kept my axe near the bed and let Cooper sleep on the bed with me. I didn't sleep much again. Around 2 a.m., Cooper growled. A low, steady sound. His ears perked up and he faced the door. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Not at first. Then I heard it. Snow crunching outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Then silence. Then 2 more steps. Right outside the cabin. I stood up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. Didn't turn it on. Just held it like a club. I waited by the window. Didn't open the curtain. Cooper stood at attention, growling again but not barking. Then nothing. It just stopped. After a few minutes, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Pitch black, freezing cold. No one there. I scanned the trees with the flashlight. Nothing. Just thick woods and falling snow. No fresh tracks either. The wind might have covered them. I don't know. I went back inside and locked the door again. Sat in the chair by the fire until morning. The next day, I walked around the cabin with Cooper. Looked for anything. Trash, prints, broken branches. We followed a faint trail leading off toward the lake. The same lake Julia and I used to walk to. It was about a mile through the woods. I figured I might as well check it out. The trail was faint and snow-covered, but about halfway there, Cooper stopped. Hackles raised, growling again. He stared off into the trees to our right. I saw it then, a figure, standing still between the trees, about 50 yards away. I couldn't make out a face, just a big coat, tall, still as a rock. I shouted, asked if they needed help. I know I said I didn't want any conversation in the story, but I did yell. Reflex, I guess. But the figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there. I took a step forward and raised the flashlight. Gone. Just trees. No sound. No footprints. Cooper barked once and bolted forward. I called him back. He ran a small loop around the area, nose to the ground, then came back confused. I didn't see anything else the rest of the walk, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The lake was frozen over, quiet, still. A few ice fishing holes that looked fresh, but no signs of a shelter or tools. We went back fast. That night, I stacked furniture against the door, kept the axe in one hand while I sat by the window with the flashlight off. Around midnight, I heard something again, this time scratching. On the wall, not the door, the wall, right behind my head. I moved away, stood up slowly, and Cooper growled again. He faced the corner of the cabin and barked, sharp and loud. The sound stopped. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door, ran around the side. Nothing, just snow. I kept circling the cabin until I found something behind the woodshed. Boot prints. Huge, deep, but only one set. They stopped about 10 feet from the cabin. just stopped. I went back inside and didn't sleep at all. By the fourth day, I was mentally done. I packed my bag and decided to head back. I locked the place up as best I could and started the hike back to the truck. Except the truck wasn't there. Gone. Not stolen. Just not where I parked it. There were no tracks leading away. Just snow. Clean, undisturbed snow. I thought I was losing my mind. I circled the area 3 times. Nothing. Not even Cooper could pick up a scent trail. I was about to start hiking back toward the highway when I saw it. About 50 yards into the trees, an old camper. Rusted. Covered in moss. I'd never seen it before. Looked like it had been there for decades. No path leading to it. Curiosity got the better of me.
I walked over.
The door was open. Inside, there were blankets, cans of food, a wood stove that hadn't been used in years, and a wall covered in photos. Photos of me and Julia. Some from the early 2000s. Some from just last week. Photos of me arriving at the cabin. Me walking Cooper near the lake. One of me standing on the porch last night. I nearly dropped the flashlight. I backed out slowly, scanned the woods and ran. Ran for hours with Cooper at my side until I finally reached the highway. Waving my arms like a lunatic until someone stopped. The cops didn't find anything. Not the camper. Not the prints. Not the photos. Not even the cabin at first. When they went back, everything looked undisturbed, like no one had been there for years. They found my truck parked in a ditch 3 miles away with the keys in the ignition. They told me I must have been hallucinating from stress, from grief, from lack of sleep. Maybe, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Something was watching me up there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person. Someone who knew me. Someone who had been watching Julia too. I don't know who they were, but I know they're still out there. And I know I'm never going back to that cabin again. It was the fall of 2019, around the middle of October. I was 36 back then, living in northern Arkansas, working construction full-time, and getting real tired of the city noise. My name's Matt, but I wasn't exactly the type of guy people remembered by name. I had a short beard, decent build from work, and kept to myself mostly. The year had been rough. My job had me working 6 days a week on a bridge project near Fayetteville, and I hadn't had a break in months. So when the job finally wrapped up, I took a week off. I didn't want beaches or hotels. I just wanted some quiet, somewhere far, cold, and still. No traffic, no people. A buddy of mine from work, Jeff, mentioned a place up in the Ozarks. Said his uncle had passed away back in 2003, left behind a small hunting cabin way up on private land near the Buffalo River. The place hadn't been used in years, but Jeff said it still stood solid. His uncle had been a sheriff's deputy for 30 years, retired early, got weird after his wife died, and spent most of his time in that cabin. No one really went there after he passed, just left it alone. Jeff said I could stay there if I wanted, gave me rough directions, hand-drawn on a wrinkled paper napkin, and told me there was an old dirt road that split off a county road near Ponca, leading into the woods. There'd be a small gate, no lock. Follow the dirt road for about a mile. You'll see the cabin on the right, under a slope of rocks. That's all he gave me. I packed light, just my hiking pack, a cooler with food, a few gallons of water, and a sleeping bag. I brought a rifle too, my old .30-06, for peace of mind, not hunting. I'd camped alone plenty of times, but something about going so deep into the woods always made me feel better when I had something solid in my hands. I left before sunrise on a Wednesday, drove my truck north through Jasper, then west through Ponca, and found the gravel road Jeff told me about. The road curved through a valley of thick trees. After a few minutes, I spotted the gate. It was just two rusted metal posts and a single bar across them, barely hanging. I pushed it open and drove through. The road up to the cabin was worse than I expected. Grass and brush had grown into the ruts, branches scraped my truck's sides, and there were places where the ground looked soft like it had flooded in the past. But after about a mile, I saw it, the cabin. It sat under a low rock ledge, almost tucked into the hillside, made of dark, weathered logs. The porch sagged a little in the middle. The windows were still intact, and the door looked solid. No broken glass, no signs of animals getting in. Just forgotten. I parked to the side, grabbed my pack, and walked in. The place smelled musty, like it had been closed up a long time. Dust covered everything, but there wasn't any mold or rot. I could still see the lines in the wooden floor. The main room had a stone fireplace, a small table, 2 chairs, and an old cot in the corner with springs that groaned when I touched them. The back had a narrow hallway with a storage closet and a second room that looked like it had once been a pantry. The cabin had no power, that much I knew, but it had an old iron stove and some rusted pots hanging on nails. I set my gear down and aired the place out. For some reason, it felt right. Quiet, still, and removed from the mess of normal life. I stayed on the porch most of that first afternoon, just listening to the wind move through the trees. That first night, I made a fire in the pit out back and sat near it until the cold set in. The stars were sharp, clear, almost too close. I went to bed early, the cabin groaning a little under the breeze. I slept light, used to city sounds, and kept my rifle beside the cot. The night passed without much noise. The next day, I hiked around the ridge behind the cabin. The forest was thick with oak and cedar. Leaves covered the ground in piles, and everything smelled damp. I found a dry creek bed with some animal tracks in the mud, probably deer. Around noon, I climbed up a steep hill and looked back. The cabin was barely visible through the trees. That's how deep in I was. On the third morning, I noticed something off. It wasn't big, just a set of small drag marks in the dirt near the back porch, like something had been pulled across the ground overnight. I figured maybe an animal, raccoon or fox, had been sniffing around, but the pattern was strange. 2 thin lines, perfectly parallel, no footprints with them. I brushed it off. Later that day, I went exploring east of the cabin, deeper into the woods. I found an old fence line, long collapsed. Barbed wire rusted out, posts rotted. Beyond it, I found something that made my stomach turn. A second structure. It was more like a shack. The roof had caved in, and trees had grown through part of it. Inside, there were metal shelves, a few shattered glass jars, and piles of newspapers turned to mush. In the corner, under a rotting tarp, I found what looked like a box of spent shell casings. .38 special, most of them. There was an old sheriff's badge in the dirt. I didn't take it, just left it where it was. That night, I heard something outside, just after midnight. A slow scraping sound, like something heavy brushing against the porch floor. I didn't move, just laid still with the rifle on my chest. Passed after a few minutes. I told myself it was an animal again, maybe a bear rubbing against the railing. But I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were marks again, those same thin lines dragged across the dirt. But this time, they were on the wooden boards too, clear as anything. Parallel scrapes, like metal had been pulled across the wood. I started thinking about Jeff's uncle again. A cop who retired, came up here alone, and never really left. Jeff said the guy had been different near the end. Wouldn't talk much, just kept to himself. That second shack I'd found didn't feel like it was built for storage. It had more of a bunker feel. The badge, the ammo, he was still playing cop up here, even when there was no one left to protect. On the 5th day, I decided to pack up early. I didn't feel right anymore. The woods felt different, like something was waiting, I loaded my cooler, folded my sleeping bag, and stepped outside. That's when I noticed the drag marks were fresher, deep and wide. They led from the woods to the corner of the cabin. I followed them slowly with the rifle ready. About 20 yards in, I found where they stopped, just behind a tree. There were signs of something heavy being placed there and then removed again. No blood, no fur, just a clean, worn spot in the dirt, like someone or something had sat there watching. That's when I found the boot print, clear, deep, and definitely human, right next to the tree. I checked the size, it wasn't mine. Bigger. Warnhail. Someone had been out here, watching, maybe for days. I went back inside and locked the door, even though it was just a simple latch. Sat in the corner with the rifle across my lap. I waited until first light, not sleeping. As soon as it was light enough to drive, I got in the truck and left. Didn't stop until I hit the main road. I told Jeff what I saw when I got back to town. He didn't say much, just looked at me for a while and said his uncle used to talk about trespassers. Said there were folks in those woods that didn't want to be seen. Off-grid types. He thought it was just paranoia. I didn't. A week later, I called a Forest Service contact and gave them rough coordinates. Asked them to check on the old cabin. They called me back and said they didn't find anything. Just a collapsed shack and a mostly intact cabin. No sign of anyone else. I haven't been back since. Still live in Arkansas. Still go hiking. But I don't go deep like that anymore. Not where the trees are too thick and the map stops showing roads. That cabin still stands, far as I know. The old cop's place. Out past the ridge, behind the trees, where something or someone dragged metal in the night and waited. My name is Clay Turner. I was 33 years old in the fall of 2013 when I was assigned a temporary rotation deep in the Uncompahgre National Forest in western Colorado. I'd been working as a park ranger for just over 8 years by then. Most of my work was in easier access areas, monitoring trails, helping visitors, doing fire checks, basic stuff. But late that summer, one of the older rangers named Bill took a leave for surgery. They needed someone to cover his fall post out in a remote section of forest known as Long Hollow. I was the only one who didn't have a family or any real reason to stay close, so I volunteered. Long Hollow wasn't an easy place to reach. It sat miles from the nearest paved road, about an hour's drive from the ranger station, then another 45 minutes on foot or ATV. The area had a one-room cabin used for overnight stays, weather reporting, and game tracking. It had no cell service, no internet, no landline, just a radio that worked, most of the time when the weather didn't block it. I got the keys and supplies at the beginning of September and drove up with a trailer full of gear, food, fuel, propane, extra clothes, first aid stuff, and a field journal. I'd be out there for 30 days, with scheduled check-ins once every 3 days via the cabin's shortwave. I was used to being alone, and the remoteness didn't bother me at first. I liked the idea of having some quiet. The first few days were peaceful. The cabin itself was small, weathered gray wood, standing at the edge of a clearing. There was a shed out back full of firewood, an outhouse about 100 feet downhill, and a small creek that ran behind the property. The forest around me was thick and quiet, mostly pine and spruce. There was a game camera mounted to a tree outside, which I was supposed to check weekly. Other than that, I just logged the weather, patrolled the trails, and watched for any signs of fires, illegal hunters, or trouble. The cabin had one bed, one chair, a small table, a gas stove, and a propane lantern. It wasn't luxurious, but it worked. I had plenty of time to read, hike, write, and think. I kept a schedule. Woke at 6, boiled water, did my check-in hikes, came back around noon, wrote in my journal, cleaned my gear, then turned in early. I was far from bored, but by the end of the first week, small things started to bother me. Nothing dramatic, just off. Like I'd walk out behind the cabin and swear the hatchet wasn't where I left it, or find boot tracks leading up the trail I hadn't walked that day. I told myself it was probably mine from before, or I just forgot. Still, I started being more careful. I began marking things, small stones over tool handles, notches in the dirt by the door, just to keep track. One morning, I woke to find my boot laces untied and soaked. I'd left them on the floor near the bed, but they were across the room, damp and caked with mud. There hadn't been any rain that night. That was when I started locking the cabin door from the inside with a second latch I rigged up. I also blocked the back window with a wooden board. The cabin wasn't designed for defense, but I started treating it like it might need to be. During one of my patrols on the 12th day, I found a small pile of bones, ribs, and part of a spine picked clean. Looked like deer, but what caught my attention was the way it was arranged. Not scattered by scavengers, but laid in a neat half circle, like someone placed each piece carefully. No footprints around it, at least none I could see. I logged it, took photos with the field camera, and hiked back to the cabin early. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days later, I went to check the game camera. The files were stored on a small SD card, and I brought my handheld reader to check them. The first dozen images were normal deer, squirrels, a bear, but the last image caught me off guard. It was a photo taken at night, timestamped 3:47 a.m. It showed the cabin door slightly open, and what looked like a person's back. Bare, no shirt, crouched low just at the edge of the frame. I stared at it for minutes. The next image was blank, just black. I didn't remember the door being open that night. I didn't remember hearing anything, but the lock had still been latched in the morning. I hiked the perimeter that day, fast, checking for signs. I found none. No boot prints, no sign of forced entry. I started carrying my sidearm even inside the cabin. The Forest Service issues us a Glock 20 for bears, and I kept it loaded on the table next to my bed from then on. On the 19th night, it rained hard. I remember the sound on the tin roof was loud enough to drown out the wind. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the shed door banging against its frame. I'd secured it with a latch earlier that day. I put on my jacket, took the gun, and went out with my flashlight. The rain soaked me in seconds. When I reached the shed, the door was wide open. The latch hadn't been broken. It looked like it was unhooked. Inside, a few things were missing. 2 pieces of firewood, a tarp, and a small hand shovel. None of it made sense. It wasn't like an animal dragged it off. Something had taken it. I shut the door, latched it again, and walked the perimeter with my flashlight until the batteries started to die. When I got back inside, I pushed the table and chair up against the door and didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I checked the radio and made a routine check-in. Nothing felt routine. I didn't mention the shed, or the bones, or the figure in the photo. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't sound paranoid. I just said things were fine and gave my usual weather update. That afternoon, I found something else. Near the trail about half a mile west of the cabin, just off a game path, someone had built a sort of lean-to. Not a shelter for camping, more like a blind, like something a hunter would use to hide in. It was made from branches, covered in moss and a bit of that missing tarp. Inside it was a pile of animal bones, mostly rodents and birds, arranged neatly. In the middle was my missing hatchet. I didn't touch any of it. I stood there a long time, then backed away and hiked straight back. I started packing that night. I had 11 days left in the rotation, but something told me not to stay. I made the plan to leave the next morning and hike back toward the access road where I could call in for pickup. But that night, everything escalated. It was just past 2 a.m. when I heard it. A steady crunching sound outside the cabin, like someone walking slowly over leaves. Then silence. Then another set of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then something touched the door. I heard it, a soft scrape. Not a knock, just contact. I held my breath and grabbed the pistol from the table. I stayed like that, sitting in bed, hand on the grip, barely breathing. The footsteps moved to the back of the cabin. I heard one creak on the wooden porch outside the rear wall. Then silence. I waited another hour before moving. I never turned the lights on, just waited for the first sign of dawn. The moment I saw gray light outside the window, I opened the door with the gun raised and stepped out. The ground was damp, the air was cold. No tracks, but a piece of the tarp from the blind had been tied around the door handle. I left everything, just shoved what I could in my bag and started hiking down. The radio was in my pack, and I called for pickup halfway through the hike. Took them 4 hours to reach me, but I stayed put in a clearing where I could see all around. When the ranger truck finally came up the trail, I didn't say much, just that I was cutting the rotation short. Later, back at base, I told my supervisor a toned-down version. Said I suspected a poacher might be camping out in Long Hollow, maybe trying to scare me off. They sent another ranger to check the cabin the next week. He didn't find anything unusual. The blind was gone, the bones too. Even the tarp was missing. The game camera had been taken down. There was no official report filed. No further investigation. I requested not to be placed in any deep backcountry assignments after that. Spent the rest of my time working lowland trails, then eventually transferred to Arizona. It's been years, but I still think about Long Hollow. I've looked at that one photo on the game cam dozens of times. I still have it, even though I'm not supposed to. The man, if it was a man, looked wrong somehow. His back was too narrow, his spine too defined. The position he was crouching in didn't seem natural. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't think it was someone passing through. Felt planned, like I was being watched from the start. I still don't understand how they got in the cabin that night without breaking the lock. All I know is I wasn't alone, and whatever it was, it didn't want me there. I had taken some time off in the fall of 2021. I was 36 back then, and I needed a break from everything: work, noise, and the constant pull of notifications. My name is Darren Rhodes, and I worked as a structural inspector for a small firm in Salt Lake City. A friend of mine who'd moved to Arizona had told me about an old cabin his uncle used to own in a remote part of Utah, near the La Salle Mountains. It was up some forest road off Highway 46, not too far from the Colorado border, but far enough that it wasn't anywhere people normally wandered. I didn't think twice. I packed up my gear, got some supplies for a week, and drove out there in my old Chevy Suburban. The road to the cabin turned into gravel for the last 10 miles. Trees closed in, yellow leaves littered the trail, and the temperature dropped with the elevation. The cabin was tucked down an incline past a rusted wire gate. There was no electricity, no water, just a little wood stove, an outhouse, and 4 walls. The roof had been patched with sheet metal. One side of the cabin faced a thick wall of trees, and the other opened up to a sloping meadow that fell away into a narrow creek bed. There wasn't a neighbor for miles. It was perfect. I settled in that first day, unloaded my food, sleeping bag, a few lanterns, a rifle I kept in case of animals, and a pair of binoculars I used for birdwatching. The plan was to hike during the day, maybe fish if the stream was deep enough. At night, I'd cook something simple and just sit out under the sky. The first 3 days were uneventful, peaceful even. It was cold at night, but not unbearable. I saw elk up on the ridge, deer lower in the trees, and some raccoon prints near the stream. I kept the firewood stacked and dry inside the cabin and listened to the sounds of wind moving through the trees. There was no cell signal, just the noise of the forest. It reminded me of being a kid, when my uncle used to take me out to his trailer in the desert. But on the fourth day, things changed. I'd hiked up a steep hill that morning, thinking I might get a better view of the range from higher ground. On the way back down, about half a mile from the cabin, I noticed something strange in the dirt. Tracks, not from an animal I recognized. Not deer, not elk, not coyote. They looked like human footprints, but off. The spacing was weird. Some of them were deep, like someone heavy had pressed into them. Others were so faint it was like someone was tiptoeing. What really got me was the stride. Some of the steps were far apart, like someone running, but in a zigzagging line that didn't make sense. I stood over them for a while, trying to make them out. They didn't lead from anywhere, and they didn't go anywhere either. Just a short stretch of about 20 or 30 feet, meandering through the leaves. I chalked it up to erosion. Or maybe someone had come through here recently and I just missed them. It wasn't impossible, just unlikely. That night, something woke me up. I thought it was wind at first. The cabin creaked sometimes, but this was more rhythmic. Something brushing against the side of the cabin. Not hard, but steady, like someone walking slowly around it. I sat up in my bag. I listened, kept going, then stopped. Then I heard one sharp tap, like a stick hitting the outside wall. Just once. Not an accident. Deliberate. I held my breath. I didn't move. After maybe a minute, it went completely quiet again. The fire in the stove had died out and the cabin was pitch black. I reached quietly for the rifle beside me and held it across my lap. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to. I stayed sitting there, wide awake until morning. The next day, I went outside and looked around. I didn't see anything at first. Then, I saw something odd near the outhouse, about 20 feet from the cabin. A long stick propped up against the side of the building. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't a branch that had fallen. It was straight, stripped of bark, too clean. Someone had leaned it there. I picked it up and threw it into the trees. My stomach was tight. I told myself it had to be some hunter, or maybe someone messing around, but it didn't sit right with me. Later that day, I walked the area in a wide circle. I didn't find much, except for something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the creek bed, not far from where the slope turned steep, I found another set of those strange tracks. Again, they just appeared and disappeared. They were barefoot. It had been cold enough that anyone walking barefoot would have frozen their feet. That night, I kept the rifle next to me and left a lantern on. I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Not footsteps, breathing. It sounded like someone was crouched near the back wall of the cabin, just breathing slowly, heavily. I held still, ears locked on it. Then I heard what I was sure was a low growl, like a person imitating a dog. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person pretending badly to be one. The worst part was that it moved, slowly, around the cabin. I tracked it in my head, moving past the woodpile to the front, near the door, then to the far wall. And then silence. I didn't leave the cabin the next day. I stayed inside with the door barred and my back against the far wall. I only stepped out once to grab water from the stream, and I didn't go far. The day after that, I saw it. It was early morning, just after sunrise. Mist hung low over the field and the trees were still wet. I was outside, about 50 feet from the cabin, checking on a deer carcass I had spotted the day before. It had looked like a natural kill, maybe a mountain lion. But now it was gone, dragged away. Only blood smeared the grass. And that's when I saw him, standing at the edge of the tree line. A man, or at least I thought it was. He was tall, too tall maybe, and thin, wearing what looked like torn-up clothes, but they were layered oddly, like he had rags wrapped around his arms and legs. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, arms slightly away from his body, staring at me. I couldn't make out his face. He was too far, and the mist blurred the edges of him. But something about the way he stood wasn't right. His head was tilted too far to one side. His spine looked arched like he couldn't stand straight. I lifted my rifle and aimed toward him, not to shoot, just to see through the scope. But when I looked through it, he was gone. No sound, no running, just vanished into the trees. I backed up to the cabin, didn't turn my back to the woods once. That afternoon, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I shoved my gear into the truck and planned to leave by nightfall. I didn't care that I'd only been there 5 days. I didn't care about finishing the week. But my truck wouldn't start. Battery was fine.
Starter krankt.
But the engine wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood, checked connections. Fuel smelled normal.
No leaks.
But it just kept turning over and not catching. I tried again and again until I killed the battery. Nothing. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, gun in my hands, listening. And then, just before dawn, I heard it again. That same breathing. This time right under the window. I didn't move. Couldn't. I felt like a deer under a spotlight. I sat still, heart pounding. It didn't go away. It stayed for hours, just breathing every now and then, tapping something on the wood wall. Not hard, just enough to let me know it was there. It left just after sunrise. I ran outside, but there was nothing.
No footprints.
No sign of anything. Only a single handprint smeared in mud across the window. I stayed inside the rest of the day, but I made a plan. I wasn't waiting another night. I packed the essentials in my backpack. Some food, water, my map, a compass, and started walking. I left the cabin behind and headed straight north through the woods, toward where I thought the road was. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I didn't look back. It took me nearly 10 hours, but I made it to the gravel road by sundown. I followed it west until I flagged down a utility truck the next morning. When I got back to town, I filed a report. Not with the police. I knew they wouldn't do anything. I just told a ranger at the station that someone had been stalking around the cabin. He nodded, said it wasn't the first time someone reported strange people out there. Said sometimes squatters live out in the woods, hiding from the world. I never went back. I never got the truck or any of my gear. And I'll tell you this, what I saw wasn't a skinwalker. It wasn't a spirit. It was a man, or what was left of one, living out there, watching, copying the animals, dragging off kills in the night. Whatever he was doing, he wanted me gone. And he got what he wanted, because no part of me ever wants to see that place again. My name's Jack Whitman. I'm 39 now. This happened 7 years ago, back in November 2018. I was 32, single, and living in Helena, Montana. I used to do a lot of solo hunting back then, especially in the colder months when the forests emptied out and the game was more active. I liked being out there, away from the city, where the only noise was the wind through the trees and maybe the crunch of snow under my boots. My grandfather had this old hunting cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains, way out west near the Idaho border. It had been in our family since the 60s. My dad took me there when I was a kid, and I kept going long after both he and Grandpa passed. The place had no running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, 2 bunks, a rusted metal table, and a small outhouse about 50 yards out through the trees. The last time I'd been to that cabin before everything went wrong was 2014. It wasn't because I was too busy or anything. Something about it had just started to feel off. Maybe it was the aging structure, the isolation, or the way the trees had grown in too close around it over the years. Still, in late 2018, I decided to go back. I had some time off from work, and I figured it'd be good to get away. I packed everything I needed. A Remington 700, my old Ruger revolver, enough ammo, 2 weeks of dried food, camping stove, flashlight, batteries, first aid kit, and a satellite GPS. No cell service out there, of course. The truck ride took almost 5 hours from Helena, and then another hour hiking in from where the forest road ended. I parked my truck in the clearing like always and slung my gear onto my back. The cold was sharp already, and there was maybe 5 inches of snow on the ground. As I hiked in, I noticed the trail had faded more than I remembered. Trees had come down. The brush was thicker. It felt like the forest was trying to take the place back. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It looked the same but more worn. The paint had completely peeled. One of the windows was cracked. The porch sagged under my weight. The door stuck, but I shoved it open. Inside, it smelled like dust, pine, and mice. I swept out the corners, lit the lantern, and started a fire in the stove. That first night was peaceful enough. I read a bit, listened to the wind outside, and made some instant noodles with boiled snow water. I remember thinking I missed that kind of silence. Real silence. I went to bed early and slept like a rock. The next morning, I was up before sunrise, made some instant coffee, checked my rifle, and headed west of the cabin toward a ridge where I'd seen elk before. The snow made for easy tracking, but there weren't any fresh prints that day. I was gone about 5 hours. Got back in the afternoon, tired, but content. That's when I noticed the boot prints. They weren't mine. The snow was still fresh from the night before, and I knew exactly where I'd walked. These prints came in from the woods behind the cabin, north side, where the trees are thickest. I followed them slowly, rifle in hand. They led right up to the back wall of the cabin, then just stopped. No prints going away, no turning back, just ended there. At first I figured maybe I missed something. Snow can cover tracks quick, or maybe they'd backtracked perfectly. But the way they just ended didn't sit right. I checked around the cabin. No damage. Door still locked. Nothing missing. But I didn't like it. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the lantern on low and the rifle next to me. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps outside. I even stepped out once around 2 a.m. to check. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. The third day, I hunted less. I stayed within a mile of the cabin. I wasn't scared exactly, just cautious. I didn't want to admit I was letting some dumb tracks in the snow get to me, but that feeling was there, like I wasn't alone. That afternoon, when I got back, something else was off. My gear had been moved. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged, but my pack had been unzipped. The flashlight that I always left on the table was on the floor. My box of ammo was turned sideways. I know I didn't leave it that way. I'm careful with my stuff. Too careful to forget like that. I searched the whole cabin. Cleared it corner to corner with my revolver drawn. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. Windows still shut. The only tracks outside were mine. I decided that night I wouldn't stay much longer. Maybe one more day. I had enough meat from a rabbit I'd snared to last. I just wanted one more quiet sunrise. But I didn't get that. That night I heard footsteps. Not mice. Not wind. Boots. I was lying in bed with my ears open. The stove was burning low. Then I heard them crunch, crunch. Slow steps outside circling the cabin. I didn't move. I just listened. They went all the way around. Paused at the front door. Then nothing. I sat up, grabbed the revolver, crept to the window. I didn't see anyone, but the prints were back. Clear as day in the moonlight. One set, coming in from the trees, going around the cabin, then back into the woods. This time they didn't just stop. They led away toward the North Ridge. I stayed up the rest of the night, rifle across my knees. I didn't light the lantern, just sat in the dark and watched. The first light, I packed everything. I should have left then, but I needed to know. I followed the tracks. Rifle ready, I moved slow. The prints led deep into the trees, maybe a quarter mile. Then I found the camp. It wasn't much, just a pile of branches arranged as shelter. Empty food wrappers, plastic tarp, and rope. The rope wasn't for hunting. It was tied into loops, like restraints. There was also a knife stuck into a stump. Big blade, rusted handle, and next to it an old Polaroid photo, faded from the cold. It was a picture of the cabin. My cabin. From the outside. Same angle as the front porch. But here's the thing, it was taken recently. There was snow on the roof, the cracked window, my boot prints in the photo. Someone had been watching me. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold. I backed out slow, didn't touch a thing. Got back to the cabin and packed the rest of my gear in minutes. Shoved it all into my backpack and left. Didn't stop to rest. Just hiked back to the truck in one long push. Got there by sunset, soaked in sweat. I didn't see anyone on the trail, but I kept checking behind me the whole time. I didn't call the cops. I should have. But what was I gonna say? That someone camped in the woods and took a photo? It wasn't illegal. Creepy, yes, but not a crime. Still, I never went back. That cabin's probably still out there, falling apart in the snow. Whoever that was, maybe a squatter, maybe someone sicker than that. I don't know. But I do know I was being watched. Maybe from the trees. Maybe through that cracked window. Every noise, every move I made, changed something in me. I still hunt, but never alone. Never for that long. And never in places where people can vanish without a trace. Because sometimes, the scariest thing in the woods isn't an animal or a ghost. It's someone else with 2 feet, 2 hands, and a reason to hide. It was mid-September 2019, and I had just turned 31. I'd been working at a fabrication plant just outside of Fort Collins, Colorado, and my life was feeling like a loop. I'd wake up early, grind through 9 or 10 hours of repetitive welding and grinding, drive home through the same traffic, eat the same frozen dinners, and stare at the same walls. I needed a break. Nothing wild. No beach trips or cities. I just wanted quiet, some time alone, away from everything and everyone. So I took 5 days off, packed up some gear, and rented a small off-grid cabin up in the Route National Forest. The listing said it was isolated, no cell service, no electricity, no neighbors for miles, and that sounded perfect to me. It was about 2.5 hours northwest of Fort Collins. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. Just told my friend Derek I'd be off the grid for a while and would text him when I got back to service. I left on a Monday morning around 10 a.m. It was already starting to feel like fall, dry air, trees just starting to turn yellow in the higher elevations. I drove my Tacoma up a series of narrowing dirt roads, past thinning traffic, and deeper into the mountains. The road to the cabin turned off onto a barely marked track, more like a Jeep trail than a real road. My tires kicked up rocks and dust as I climbed through the thick pines, bouncing slowly around turns that looked like they hadn't been driven in years. After about 20 minutes of rough crawling, I came around a bend and saw it. A small wooden cabin nestled between tall spruces, set on a rise above a narrow valley. There was a little clearing in front of it where I parked. It looked weathered but solid, hand-cut logs, old tin roof, a chimney with some moss growing along one side. It had one door, a few small windows, and a rusty metal fire pit off to one side. Behind it, the land sloped steeply down into thick woods. No sound, just wind and the distant creak of trees. I unloaded my gear. Food, a cot and sleeping bag, my old camping stove, an axe, and a few other things. The cabin didn't have running water, but the listing had said there was a spring about 300 yards out back, marked by a line of stones. Inside, the place was plain but decent. One room, wooden floor, a cast iron stove in the corner, shelves with some old tools, pots, and a few dusty lanterns. A narrow window looked out over the clearing. The air smelled like dry wood and dust. By the time I got settled and had some food, it was nearly evening. I walked out behind the cabin with a jug to find the spring. Sure enough, I followed a barely visible trail of flat stones and eventually heard the trickle of water. There was a small rocky dip where clear water was bubbling up through gravel. I filled the jug, sat for a bit, then headed back. I didn't see any tracks or signs of animals. It felt completely untouched. That first night, I sat outside for a while beside the fire pit. The stars came out one by one, thick and bright, with no light pollution. I heard some distant owls, a few rustles in the brush, probably rabbits or raccoons. Around 10, I went inside, bolted the door, and lay down on my cot. It was cold, but I had my sleeping bag and a thick blanket. I slept hard and deep. The second day was peaceful. I hiked a little in the morning, not far, just exploring around. I found a half-fallen hunting stand out past the ridge to the east, maybe a mile away. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were some old soda cans crushed under the leaves, but otherwise it felt like no one came out this way anymore. That afternoon I chopped some wood, cooked a basic dinner, and sat watching the fire. My head felt clear for the first time in a while, but that night something changed. I had gone to bed early, maybe around 9:30. I left the window cracked open a bit for air. Sometime in the middle of the night, had to be 2 or 3 a.m. I woke up, not sure why at first. There wasn't a sound, but I had this sharp, prickling feeling, like something was wrong. I stayed still, listening. After maybe 10 or 15 seconds, I heard it. A dull, dragging sound, very faint, came from outside. It sounded like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. Then a stop, then another short scrape, then nothing. My mouth went dry. I slowly sat up on the cot and reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just stayed there, listening. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. A deer dragging a hoof, a bear nosing around. But it didn't sound like that. It didn't move like that. It sounded deliberate. I stayed awake until dawn. No more sounds.
No knocks. No scratching.
Nothing. When the light started to creep through the trees, I got up and stepped outside. The ground was cold and damp with dew. I looked around the clearing. My truck was fine. The fire pit was untouched. But over by the side of the cabin, just off the corner of the wall, I saw something strange. There were 2 narrow lines in the dirt, parallel, maybe 4 feet long, like something heavy had been dragged. I crouched down. The dirt was disturbed. Dry pine needles pushed aside. The tracks started at the tree-line and stopped right at the cabin wall. There weren't any footprints.
No claw marks.
Just those lines. I stood there for a while, staring, heart thudding. I couldn't make sense of it. Eventually, I smoothed the tracks over with a branch, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was probably a log that had rolled down the slope, or maybe a big branch fell and slid. Something natural, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the axe near me. Every sound in the woods made me turn my head. The trees felt closer. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. That night, I didn't sleep much, and on the 4th day, things got worse. It was early afternoon, and I decided to hike back to the spring. I was running low on water, and the exercise would help clear my head. I followed the stones down the slope, moving slower than before. I kept looking over my shoulder. When I reached the spring, I bent down to fill the jug, and then froze. There were footprints, human footprints, clear in the mud around the edge of the spring. They weren't mine. I always stepped in the same place on the flat stones. These were fresh, deeper, slightly wider than my boots, and they led away from the spring back toward the trees. My pulse started hammering. I stood up fast, looking all around. Nothing. The woods were quiet, but I felt like I was being watched. I picked up the jug, sloshed in what I could, and walked quickly back up the hill, axe in one hand. Back at the cabin, I paced in circles. Someone had been out there while I slept. While I was in the cabin, there was no sign of another car.
No paths.
The road I came up was too rough for most vehicles. Had someone hiked in? Why? That night, I barricaded the door. I pulled my truck closer to block the cabin's front edge, piled wood against the doorframe, and kept my flashlight and axe beside the cot. I lay in my sleeping bag with my boots on. At some point after midnight, I heard the dragging again. Slow, long, dry, closer than before. Then a thump, soft, like something leaned against the wall outside. Then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loud. I just lay there, heart in my throat, every nerve sharp. I waited for a sound, anything, but nothing else happened. At first light, I opened the door and stepped outside. Something had been there. There were marks on the cabin wall. Not deep, but clear, 3 long smudges, like dirty handprints, but wider, almost like someone with gloves had pressed their hands there. Below them, the 2 dragging tracks again. This time, they curved away into the trees. I'd had enough. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. Didn't eat. Didn't stop. I threw my gear into the truck, scanned the tree line one last time, and drove back down the trail as fast as the road allowed. My hands were shaking the whole time. When I hit pavement again, I didn't stop until I had full signal. I pulled into a gas station parking lot, locked the doors, and just sat there for almost half an hour. I texted Derek, told him I was fine, didn't tell him anything else. Later that week, I emailed the rental host and asked if anyone else had access to the property. He said no. He said the land had been in his family for decades, and no one had been up there in over 2 years except him and whoever rented it. He seemed surprised. I didn't press further. I never went back. I don't think I ever will. I still don't know what I saw or who was out there, but I know this. Something wasn't right at that cabin, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. I was 34 when I decided to take that trip into the mountains. It was the fall of 2019, just a few weeks before the cold really set in. I lived alone in a small town outside of Helena, Montana, and I worked from home most days doing freelance repair work for old electronics. I needed a break from screens and the same quiet town roads, and especially from thinking about the year I was having. A friend of mine had died in an accident a few months earlier. We weren't even that close anymore, but it hit me harder than I expected. That's probably what pushed me to get away from everything for a bit. I just wanted to disappear for a few days. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to think. I loaded up my truck with gear, food, water, and a hunting rifle just in case. I had found a spot on an old forestry map where the trails didn't connect to much of anything anymore. It was supposed to be part of a discontinued ranger area. The terrain looked steep in some parts, and the logging roads leading in were marked as unmaintained. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove up early on a Thursday morning. The sun was already high, and the roads were mostly dry. I passed through a few patches of thick forest where the trees leaned over the road so much it looked like a tunnel. No houses, no signs, just dirt and gravel and pine needles. I had downloaded a map offline and pinned a spot near a creek that looked remote enough for me to be left alone, but not so far out that I couldn't hike back to the truck if something went wrong. I parked at a bend in the road and walked about 3 miles in before I found a decent spot beside the creek. There was an open clearing with a few fallen logs that looked like they'd been there for decades. I pitched my tent and got a fire going. The air smelled like wet bark and distant smoke. I felt okay. Not great, but better. I made some instant food on my little stove and watched the sky turn dark. No cell service, no noise but water and wind. That first night passed without anything strange. The next day, I followed the creek upstream, not for any reason other than to move and clear my head. It twisted through the trees and widened in some places. After about an hour of walking, I came across something I didn't expect. A trail. Not wide, not official looking, but worn enough to be there for a reason. It sloped up through the trees, almost hidden, like it hadn't been walked in years. There were broken branches and thick ferns overgrowing the path. I followed it. I didn't really think about why, I just did. After 20 or 30 minutes, I found something else. It was a cabin, an old one. No road, no signs, no clearings. Just a dark, weathered shape between the trees, with a rusted roof and a sagging porch. It didn't look like the kind of place you stumble across unless you're seriously off course. The windows were boarded up with planks that had gone gray from age. The front door hung crooked on its frame. The whole structure leaned slightly to the right like it had sunk on one side over time. There were no tire tracks, no wires, no fences. It was just there. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. I don't know what I expected. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, the bigger part, just wanted to see what was inside. The whole thing felt wrong, too quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it mattered. Like it wasn't random I'd found it. I stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked and gave under my boots in some spots. I tried the door, and it opened with a sound that felt too loud in that still forest. Inside, it was dark. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight coming from cracks in the walls. There were two small rooms, one that looked like it had been a kitchen, and another like a bedroom. The place had been abandoned for a long time. Spiderwebs, piles of dry leaves in the corners, mold on the ceiling beams. There was a metal bed frame in the back room. No mattress, just a pile of torn cloth and mouse droppings. A shelf with a few rusted cans of food. In the kitchen, the cabinets were either open or broken off the hinges. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, half covered in ash. It was clear nobody had been here for decades. But then I found something that didn't make sense. In the corner of the kitchen, under the cabinet, was a newer-looking backpack. Black nylon with working zippers. It had some dirt on it, but it wasn't the kind of dirt that takes years to build up. It was recent. I crouched down and opened it. Inside were some energy bars, a bottle of water, a flashlight, and a phone with a cracked screen. No ID, no wallet, no clothes. Just those few things. I checked the phone. Dead. I had a small charger in my own backpack and hooked it up later when I got back to my tent. But right then, standing inside that cabin, I knew someone else had been there. Maybe not long ago. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent listening to every twig snap and breeze roll through the trees. I had the rifle beside me, safety off. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't feel alone anymore. The next day I went back to the cabin. I don't know why. Maybe to see if anything had changed. Maybe to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the backpack. It was still there. Nothing had moved. But the more I looked, the more I started noticing little things. In the dirt outside the porch were faint boot prints. Not mine. I double-checked. These were wider, deeper, fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet. I followed them for a bit, but they vanished quickly into the pine needles. Inside, the air smelled worse than before, like something rotting. I went into the back room again. The pile of cloth on the bed frame wasn't cloth. Not really. When I looked closer, I saw it was a jacket, what was left of one. Torn open, stained, and underneath it, bones. Human, small, gray-white, brittle, not arranged neatly, just piled there like someone had thrown them and left. My heart slammed against my chest so hard I could barely breathe. I backed out of that room fast and nearly fell through a soft spot on the floor. I grabbed the door frame, caught myself, and bolted outside. My legs didn't stop moving until I got back to my tent. I packed up everything in less than 5 minutes. I didn't care about finishing the trip. I didn't even care about my original plan. Something was wrong here, very wrong, but I couldn't stop thinking about that phone. I had it in my pack. When I got back to the truck later that day, I charged it up using a battery pack. When the screen finally turned on, the lock screen showed a picture of a man, maybe late 20s, with a scruffy beard and a girl beside him. They were standing near a lake, smiling. The date on the lock screen was September 3rd, 2019. That was only 5 weeks before I found it. The phone had no signal, but I was able to open the gallery. The most recent photos were of trees, rivers, a fire pit. Then some blurry ones taken indoors. One was of the cabin kitchen, one of the fireplace, and then one that made me stop cold. It was a picture of the back room, of the bed frame, but in the picture, there was no pile of cloth.
No bones.
Just the bed frame. The photo was timestamped September 9th. Whoever had taken that photo didn't see what I saw, or maybe it hadn't been there yet. That night, I called the local sheriff's office and gave them the GPS coordinates of the cabin. I told them I had found possible human remains. I didn't go into detail. I didn't mention the backpack or the phone. I just said I found a place that needed to be looked at. They said they'd send someone up the next day. I never followed up. I didn't want to know what they found. I didn't want them asking me questions. I just wanted it all behind me. A week later, I went online and searched for missing persons reports from the region. It didn't take long. A man named Dylan Hartley, age 28, had gone missing in late August. Last seen hiking alone north of Helena. His photo matched the one on the phone. The girl in the picture was his sister. There was no update on the case, and it was still listed as open with no leads. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my closest friend. It's been over 5 years now, and I still don't know what happened in that cabin. I don't know if Dylan died there. I don't know if someone else brought his body there. I don't know who the other boot prints belong to. What I do know is this: I never should have gone into that place. I never should have opened that backpack. That cabin wasn't just abandoned. It was a grave, maybe not just one. I think about that phone sometimes, about that picture of the bed frame, about how the bones weren't there in his shot but were in mine. That means someone moved them, someone came after him, and that means someone's still out there. My name's Eric Fuller. I'm 34 years old now, but this happened back in 2016 when I was 26. I had just gotten out of a long relationship, and everything around me felt kind of fake for a while. I was working construction jobs in Indiana, and most days felt like repeats of each other. I remember thinking one night, lying awake in my small apartment near Evansville, that I needed to do something different. I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want to look at anyone's face. I just wanted to be alone, completely away from anything modern. I'd been saving some money for a few years, just bits and pieces from each job, and I ended up with about $5,000 that I wasn't using. So I made the decision to use that cash to buy materials and tools and go out into the woods and build a cabin by myself. Just a small one, just big enough for one person. I didn't want electricity or plumbing. I just wanted 4 walls, a roof, and some quiet. My uncle had some land in Kentucky, wooded, deep, and unused. He wasn't living there, and nobody really visited that part of the property anymore. It was about 40 acres of thick woods with one dirt road that curved through it. He said I could build on it if I wanted. He didn't ask questions. He was a quiet man and probably understood the appeal of being left alone. I packed my truck with tools: a chainsaw, a handsaw, an axe, a hammer, buckets of nails, a generator for when I needed to charge something or use power tools, and a basic sleeping setup. I brought tarps, some food, a camping stove, and about 10 gallons of water. It was early October, and I figured I'd have a few weeks before it got too cold to do anything. The drive to the property took about 4 hours. Most of the road was paved, but once I turned off onto that narrow dirt stretch through the trees, it felt like I was leaving everything behind. The deeper I went, the narrower it got. Tree branches scraped the sides of my truck, and I had to slow down to a crawl in some places to keep from hitting rocks or fallen limbs. The spot I picked to build was off the main dirt path, about 400 feet into the woods, up a small incline. There was a little clearing there where the trees broke just enough for sunlight to come through. It had mossy ground and tree stumps and looked like nobody had stepped foot there in years. That's where I decided I'd build it. I parked, unloaded, and set up camp that first day. I didn't do any building yet. I just walked the area, took mental notes, and thought about where I'd put things. I slept in the back of the truck that night, wrapped in a sleeping bag, listening to owls and the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful. For the next few days, I worked from sunup to sundown. I started with clearing the ground, cutting down saplings, digging shallow foundation points, and laying some temporary floor beams. I kept things simple, just a rectangle about 12 by 10 feet. No fancy design. I didn't want it to be anything special, just something I made with my hands. It rained on and off during the week, sometimes light, sometimes heavy. But on the 5th night, the rain really came down hard. I had a tarp tied over the bed of the truck, and I laid inside listening to it batter the plastic like a drum. Around 2 a.m., I had to get out and resecure a corner of the tarp that had come loose. I remember stepping out barefoot, cold water soaking through my socks immediately, and shining my flashlight up into the black sky that kept dropping water like buckets. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine. They weren't boot prints like the ones I left during the day. These were smaller and barefoot. I crouched down and touched one. The edges were still holding shape, not melted by the rain yet. They weren't there earlier in the day. They had to be fresh. My stomach knotted up. I slowly turned in a circle with my flashlight, scanning the dark trees beyond the clearing. Everything was soaked and dripping, but nothing moved. I stood there for a while, staring, waiting for something to make sense. The prints led from the trees and stopped about 15 feet from the truck, then turned around and went back into the woods. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. By sunrise, the rain had stopped, and the forest smelled like wet leaves and moss. I checked the ground again. The footprints were still there, but now softened and half melted into the muck. I followed them for a bit, but they just vanished into the underbrush. No trail, no direction, just gone. I thought about packing up that day. I really did. I sat on the edge of the truck bed for a long time just thinking about whether I was being paranoid. Maybe some kid from the neighboring property wandered through barefoot, though that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a house in miles. Still, I told myself it didn't mean anything. People walk barefoot sometimes. Maybe it was a deer print that looked strange because of the mud. I kept building. Day by day, the cabin started to take shape. I got the walls framed, then filled in the planks, hammered and nailed everything by hand. It felt good to sweat and use my muscles to feel sore at the end of the day. There were no clocks. I just worked until the light started to fade, then cleaned up, ate, and tried to sleep. But things kept happening. One night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping. It was slow and rhythmic.
Top, top, top.
Came from the other side of the truck, out in the woods. I laid still and listened. Then it stopped. Just nothing. Silence. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, I heard the same tapping, only closer, like someone knocking on a hollow log or hitting wood with a rock. I didn't sleep again that night either. A couple days later, I found one of my toolboxes open and dumped. Nails were scattered all over the dirt. My hammer was missing. I always closed that box. always latched it. I looked around thinking maybe an animal got into it, but there were no chew marks, no claw prints. Just the box popped open and the tools tossed like someone was looking for something. Then there were the stacked rocks. One morning I came out and found a small pile of river rocks stacked near where I was working. For stones, balanced neatly on top of each other. I didn't put them there. I hadn't seen those rocks before. They weren't from that area. There wasn't even a river nearby. That day I stopped working early. I sat inside the frame of the half-built cabin and stared at the woods. Every gust of wind made me flinch. Every snap of a twig felt like something creeping closer. I thought about leaving again, but I stayed. Mostly because I didn't want to admit that I was scared. That something out there, someone had gotten into my head. I hated that idea. I hated feeling like I was being watched. By the second week, I had the roof on and the inside braced. No insulation or fancy flooring, but it was closed in. I moved my sleeping setup into the cabin and started staying inside it at night. It made me feel a little safer, but only just barely. Then came the night that broke everything. It was a Thursday. It had been raining hard all day and didn't stop into the evening. Around 9 p.m., I was sitting on my sleeping bag inside the cabin, eating a can of chili, when I heard something heavy hit the sidewall. It wasn't a branch falling or anything natural. It was a thud, blunt, solid like a shoulder or a rock. I froze. Then came another hit. Then another. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, heart racing. The rain was loud on the roof, but the hits were louder. They came from the back wall this time. Then the left side. I couldn't tell if it was one person or more. The cabin shook slightly with each impact. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a gun, just tools. I held my hatchet tight and backed into the far corner of the cabin, flashlight beam jittering across the plywood walls. Then it went quiet. No hits, no movement, just rain again. And then I heard breathing, not mine, not from inside the cabin, from just outside the thin wall. Long, slow, wet breaths. I stayed frozen in that corner for what felt like an hour. The breathing stopped eventually. The hits didn't come back, but I didn't sleep. I didn't move until daylight broke through the roof cracks. When I finally opened the door and stepped outside, there were handprints smeared on the outer walls. Muddy, smeared like someone dragged their fingers down slowly. Bare feet again, small, same size as before. Just prints circling the cabin. That morning, I packed up everything I could fit back into the truck. I didn't clean up. I didn't look back at the cabin. I just drove. I didn't even go back to my apartment. I drove to my parents' place 4 hours north and stayed there for 2 weeks. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Eventually, I went back to my life, back to jobs, back to routine. But I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my uncle about the land either. A year later, I heard from a friend that a group of kids went hiking in that area and found a cabin deep in the woods. Said it looked abandoned but new. One of the hikers said they saw drawings on the inside walls. Strange ones, scratches in the wood. I never told them it was mine. I never went back. And to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. It was late October 2021. I had taken a week off work after a long stretch of night shifts. I was 35, living in Southern Oregon, and just needed to clear my head. My dog, a 3-year-old yellow lab named Boone, was the only real company I had outside of work. I'd found this old hunting cabin listed for cheap on a local classified site. No cell service, no internet, a propane tank, a wood stove, and a small outhouse about 30 feet out back. It sounded like the break I needed. The cabin sat deep in the forest near the Umpqua National Forest, a good 20 miles off the main road. The guy who rented it to me said it hadn't been used in a couple years, but it had a roof, a cot, and 4 solid walls. That was enough for me. I packed up a week's worth of food, propane for the stove, and extra supplies for Boone. The weather was already getting cold at night, but I figured the stove would be enough to get by. We left early that Monday morning and got to the dirt access road around noon. Took me another hour to get down that rutted mess of a trail. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and a couple times I thought I might have to back out and walk the rest of the way, but I finally saw the small clearing ahead. The cabin sat right in the center, gray wood planks weathered from years of rain, a rusted metal chimney poking out of the roof. The windows were dusty but intact. There was a covered porch with a sagging bench and a wind chime that rattled in the breeze. Boone jumped out the second I opened the door. He ran a few circles around the cabin before sniffing at the ground and heading toward the tree line. I called him back and unloaded the truck. The air was cool and dry, smelled like pine and dirt. It was quiet, that kind of silence that feels heavier than normal. Inside the cabin, it was exactly what I expected. Bare wood walls, a table with 1 chair, a cot with an old mattress, a cast iron stove in the corner, and shelves full of dusty canned food I wouldn't touch unless I had to. There was a small battery-powered lantern on a hook, and when I tried it, it still worked. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, unloaded the cooler, and let Boone sniff every corner. He settled in quick. I walked the perimeter while he trotted along beside me. The forest around the cabin was dense. The tree line stood like a wall, the ground covered in brown pine needles, patches of moss, and thick roots. No paths, just woods. When we got to the back of the cabin, I saw the outhouse, leaning a little, but it looked usable. A few yards past that, there was a spot where the ground looked uneven, like it had been dug up at some point. Grass hadn't grown back properly. Boone sniffed at it hard, tail stiff, then let out a low huff. It made me pause. Dogs have a way of noticing things before we do, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Probably just some animal burrow or old pit from a fire. That first night was calm. I cooked a can of chili on the propane burner, fed Boone, and read until the lantern started to dim. We both fell asleep early. The cot creaked every time I moved, and Boone snored softly on his blanket beside me. Sometime around 2 a.m., Boone let out a deep growl. Not loud, but the kind that makes you instantly alert. I sat up, listening. The forest outside was dead quiet. No wind, no night bugs, not even a distant owl. Just silence. Boone stood, walked slowly to the front door, and sniffed at the crack at the bottom. His tail was stiff, ears perked. I stayed still, heart beating in my throat, waiting. Nothing happened. After a few minutes, Boone finally walked back to his blanket and lay down, but he didn't fall back asleep for a long time. Neither did I. Next morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, nothing out of place. Maybe it was a coyote or something passing through. That day, I did some reading, whittled a piece of wood, and walked the area. Boone stayed close. He was calm, but he kept glancing into the woods like he was expecting something. When we passed the disturbed patch of dirt again, he stopped and sniffed harder than before. He even pawed at it a little. I figured I might as well take a look. I got a short-handled shovel from the truck and dug a bit. The soil was soft, loose. A few inches down, I hit something that didn't feel like dirt or rock. It was plastic, black. I cleared it more and saw it was a garbage bag, tied shut. Boone started whining, pacing in a circle. I got this weird tightness in my stomach, but I opened it anyway. Inside were bones. Not small ones either. They weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. No fur. No smell of rot. Some had dried sinew, others were clean. I pulled back more of the bag and saw what looked like a piece of cloth, dark flannel, and a boot sole. I dropped the shovel and stood there for a long time. I ended up covering it all back up. I didn't want to touch it anymore. I didn't want Boone getting near it. I walked back to the cabin with this sick, low feeling in my gut. I'd seen dead animals before, even human remains once during a volunteer river cleanup. But this felt different, too deliberate. That night I couldn't sleep. Boone was restless too, pacing near the door, then circling back to the cot. At one point I thought I heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. A soft, crunching shuffle, like someone stepping carefully across dry needles. Boone growled again, low and long. I grabbed the axe I'd left by the stove and held it tight. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to see anything. I just sat there for hours, listening. Eventually, the noise stopped. Boone laid down, but he kept his head up. Next morning, I packed up to leave. I didn't want to be there anymore. I tossed everything into the truck, called Boone, and got ready to drive out. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. Dead battery. That made no sense. I'd just driven the day before, hadn't used the radio or left lights on. I popped the hood and checked connections, nothing loose. No sign of damage. That's when Boone started barking sharp, fast barks, the kind that means someone's close. He stood at the edge of the trees behind the cabin, barking at the trees. His fur was bristled up, tail straight. I couldn't see anything. I called him back. He didn't move at first, just kept barking. Finally, he ran back to the truck, eyes wide and anxious. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, heart racing, watching the woods. I had jumper cables, but no second vehicle. My only option was to hike out. I didn't want to, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my pack, stuffed in what food I could carry, slung the axe over my back, and locked the truck. Boone stayed right at my side. The first few miles were rough. That road was barely more than a trail, and my boots slipped in the wet leaves. We made it about 3 miles before I realized I'd forgotten my phone in the glove box. No use going back. We stopped once to rest and drink water. Boone kept staring back the way we came. His ears were twitching, like he was picking up something I couldn't hear. Then he started whining. I heard it too after that. Footsteps, not animal ones, human ones. Slow, spaced out, but definite. They stopped when we stopped. Boone stared into the woods, tail low, growling now. I looked into the trees and didn't see anyone. But that sound, those steps, they didn't run, didn't hide. Just waited. I started moving faster. By the time we reached a fork where the trail joined another old fire road, I was breathing hard and soaked with sweat. I didn't look back. We finally reached a ranger station just off the highway around 6 p.m. I told them my truck had died and asked if they could radio a tow. I didn't mention the bones. 2 days later, a deputy came by my place. He asked me about the cabin where it was what I saw. I said I'd found some animal bones, nothing more. He took a few notes, nodded, and left. A week after that, I got a call from an unknown number. I let it ring. They didn't leave a voicemail. That was the end of it for the most part. But Boone changed after that. He doesn't sleep near the door anymore. He doesn't bark at squirrels or raccoons the way he used to. Every now and then, if we're out late, he'll stop and stare into the trees, and his whole body will go stiff. And every time I try to forget about that patch of dirt behind the cabin, I remember something I saw right before I left. There were boot prints in the soil, fresh ones, heavier than mine, coming out of the woods, toward the back of the cabin. Not going in, coming out, and only one set. Whoever had buried that bag hadn't been gone long, and I don't think they ever really left. I still think about that weekend every now and then. It's not like I wake up sweating from nightmares or anything like that, but it sits in the back of my mind, like a knot I never untied, always waiting for my thoughts to brush against it. This happened in 2014, just after my 30th birthday. My name's Darren. I live in Montana, in a small town called Redford. At the time, I worked full-time in construction, mostly site surveying, sometimes light equipment work. Life wasn't bad, but I felt stuck. That's why I planned the trip in the first place. I wanted quiet, not the kind you get with music or beer or sitting on your porch while people ride by on ATVs. I mean real quiet. No phones, no news, no one around. Just trees and dirt and sky. So, I rented a cabin from a guy I knew through a friend. It sat near a long-abandoned rock quarry, about 45 minutes northwest of Dillon. He said it had no plumbing but did have a working stove, wood heater, and a cot with a decent mattress. That was enough for me. He told me people didn't go out there much anymore because the quarry trail was washed out years ago and no one used the old mining road. I liked the sound of that. I packed up my pickup with enough canned food and water for a week, along with a shotgun, a small generator, some batteries, and an old Coleman lantern. I left Redford on a Thursday morning in late September. Fall was coming in slow, but you could already see the trees near the higher ridges starting to yellow. The air had that sharpness to it, like it was reminding you that winter wasn't far behind. The road to the cabin was narrow and rough, and once I passed the last ranch, I didn't see another person for miles. It took me nearly 2 hours to make the final stretch. By the time I got there, my arms were sore from gripping the wheel to keep from sliding into a ditch. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a square wood box with a metal roof and a small porch with a bench. The windows were smudged, and the place had that gray, weather-beaten look you see in old barns. But it was standing, and it was mine for the next 7 days. I unpacked, started the heater, and cracked a can of chili. That night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a thick coat, just staring out into the woods as they turned black. The quiet hit me hard. No engines, no dogs barking, no people, just wind. I remember thinking it felt like the trees were holding their breath. The first day was peaceful. I hiked down the old trail toward the quarry. It was more overgrown than I expected, but I found the edge of it. Just a wide open hole carved into the rock, filled partway with rainwater and junk from decades back. I didn't go too close to the edge because the ground felt soft. I remember noticing the silence again.
No birds.
That struck me as odd. Back at the cabin, I spent most of the afternoon chopping some dead branches I found for firewood and fixing a leak I spotted in one of the corners of the roof. As evening settled in, the air got cold quick. I lit the lantern and kept the fire going. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It sounded like shuffling, not an animal. I know the sound of deer walking through brush. This was slower, dragged out. I froze, listening. It came from behind the cabin, near the tree line. I thought maybe it was a bear, so I grabbed the shotgun and stood by the window, staring into the dark. Nothing. After a while, it stopped. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't find tracks, but I did see something weird. The ash bin I kept next to the woodpile had been moved a few feet from where I left it. Not knocked over, just moved. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it might have been the wind, even though it was pretty heavy. Still, something about it didn't sit right. On the third day, I decided to try walking around the back end of the quarry. There was an old, overgrown trail leading into thicker woods. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used once, maybe decades ago. I walked for about an hour, not going far. I found a pile of rusted old cans, like someone had camped there long ago. There was also a tree with deep cuts in the bark, almost like tally marks. A bunch of them.
I counted over 60.
I didn't like that. Back at the cabin, I spent most of the day inside. I kept feeling like something was off, like I was being watched, though I hadn't seen anyone. Just that feeling you get when the back of your neck gets tight and you don't know why. That night, I heard the sound again. Closer this time. It was steady. Slow footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't move. I sat on the cot with the shotgun across my lap. The lantern dimmed low. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. The steps stopped by the window. I didn't look. I just sat, barely breathing. I waited over an hour before finally daring to peek out. No one. The next morning I found prints. Not boots. Not bare feet either. Just marks in the soft ground, like someone had been standing still near the window. No heel, no tread, just the vague outline of weight pressed into dirt. Creeped me out. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was just rattled. Probably just a hunter or some drifter passing through. That afternoon, I went out to check the generator. I kept it about 20 yards from the cabin, down a little slope near some brush. When I got there, I found it open. The gas cap was off and the line had been cut. Not chewed, cut clean. Someone had sabotaged it. That's when I knew it wasn't just me being paranoid. I went back to the cabin fast, locked everything, and stayed inside. I didn't sleep that night. Every few hours, I thought I heard something moving outside. Once, I swear I heard something brush against the wall, slow and steady, like someone running their hand along the wood. I started counting down the days until I could leave. On the 5th night, things got worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a soft tapping on the wall right near the door. Then it moved, tapping along the front of the cabin, pausing at the windows. Then silence. My mouth was dry. My chest felt tight. I stayed completely still, holding the shotgun with both hands. Then the handle on the door moved. Just a rattle, like someone testing it. I didn't move. I just waited. It didn't open. Eventually, the sound stopped. To first light, I packed everything. I threw my gear into the truck, kept the shotgun in the front seat, and floored it down the old road. My tires skidded on the wet dirt, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. About 20 minutes from the main road, I spotted something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing just off the road behind me. They weren't walking, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't even blink. I drove until I hit the highway, then all the way back to Redford without stopping. I told the guy I rented the place from that something messed with the generator and I left early. He didn't ask questions. I never went back. A few weeks later, I looked into that quarry area, just out of curiosity. Found an old article from the 80s about a man who had lived out there off-grid. Real private guy. Had a cabin somewhere near the same quarry. Locals said he vanished one winter, never found. Some thought he just walked off into the woods and froze. Others said maybe he went mad and stayed out there, surviving however he could. I don't know who or what was near that cabin. I don't care. All I know is this: someone was out there, watching me, moving around my cabin at night, sabotaging things, testing me, and I don't think I was the first. My name is Evan Ward. I was 41 years old the summer I went back to the cabin. It had been more than 20 years since I'd been there. The cabin had once belonged to my Uncle Ray, my dad's older brother. After he passed away from a stroke in 2002, the cabin just sat there for years. Nobody in the family wanted it. It was deep in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, not far from a small town called Amasa. That part of the country is thick with trees, muddy trails, and long empty stretches of road. It's one of those places where you feel like the trees are closing in on you the deeper you go. I never thought I'd go back to that place. But after my divorce in early 2023, I started looking for somewhere to get away for a while. My job at the warehouse let me take a few weeks off, and I figured it was better than staying in the same house where everything reminded me of my ex-wife. I didn't have a plan. I just wanted to disappear for a bit, to think, to maybe clear my head. I had forgotten the cabin still technically belonged to me, After my uncle died, the property passed to my dad. When he passed in 2017, it quietly shifted to me. I'd never paid it any attention, but when I called the county office to ask about it, I was told the land was still in my name. No one had touched it in years. No taxes were owed. It was like the place had just been waiting. I packed up my old truck with the essentials: clothes, water, canned food, a cot, some tools, a tarp, a small generator, and my 12-gauge shotgun, just in case. I brought my dog, Scout, a 6-year-old chocolate lab. He wasn't trained for protection or anything, but I figured he'd be good company and maybe give me a heads up if anyone or anything got too close. It took me 10 hours to get there from my house near Madison, Wisconsin. Most of the trip was long highways, but the last 2 hours were winding forest roads, gravel and dirt, sometimes nothing more than 2 tire tracks disappearing into the trees. I lost cell service halfway in. The cabin looked worse than I expected. The roof had patches of moss on it, and some of the wooden boards were warped and cracked. The small porch had mostly collapsed, and there was a fallen pine tree lying about 20 feet from the side wall, its branches dried and broken like skeletal arms reaching out. Still, the structure stood. It hadn't been vandalized. No broken windows.
No graffiti.
Just silence and the thick smell of old wood and pine needles. It felt like I had stepped into a forgotten part of time. The first night was quiet. I set up a cot near the fireplace inside. The fireplace was full of ash, but after clearing it out, I managed to get a small fire going using some dry branches and paper for my pack. Scout lay beside me, head on his paws, ears twitching at every sound outside. I didn't sleep well, not because I was scared, just aware of how far I was from anything or anyone. You don't realize how loud silence can be until you're in the middle of nowhere. The next few days were spent fixing things. I reinforced the front door, patched some of the roof with tarp and nails, cleaned out the inside. There were old food cans in the pantry, rusted beyond saving, and a few old photos in drawers, pictures of my uncle fishing, sitting on the porch, standing in the snow. It made the place feel heavier, like there were memories soaked into the walls. By the 5th day, something started bothering me. It was small at first. Scout would suddenly stare at the treeline, ears up, body rigid. I'd look where he looked, but I never saw anything, just trees and brush. But his behavior was different. At home, he was lazy, liked to roll on his back and nap. Here, he was always alert. Sometimes I'd wake up at night and find him sitting at the door, staring out through the cracks. I told myself it was just animals, deer, maybe a bear or two. It was the woods, after all. But Scout never barked, never growled. He just watched, and that made me uneasy. One night, after about a week, I was sitting on the steps of the front porch with a cup of coffee. The air was cool and still, that kind of cold that sinks into your skin even in summer. Scout was beside me. I saw him jerk his head toward the left side of the clearing. I turned too, and for just a second, I thought I saw movement, a shape between the trees. Low, fast. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stood up, walked to the edge of the clearing. I didn't go into the woods. I just listened. No sound, not even birds. It was the stillest silence I'd ever felt, like the woods were holding their breath. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I kept the shotgun loaded beside my cot. The next day, I decided to put up some small traps around the clearing. Nothing serious, just some tripwires made with fishing line and soda cans tied to branches. I wasn't hunting. I just wanted to know if anything was walking around while I slept. 2 nights later, around 3 a.m., I heard the cans rattle. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a squirrel. I know what that sounds like. This was deliberate, a dragging movement, metal on metal, followed by a crunch of twigs. I didn't move. Scout was already up, his nose to the door, tail down, body stiff. I didn't open the door. I just waited. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The next morning, I went out and checked the traps. One of them was sprung, the cans scattered, and right beside them I found tracks. Bare human footprints.
No shoes. No socks.
Just bare, dirty feet in the mud. That's when I started to feel real fear. It wasn't just me and my dog out there. There was someone else. I didn't pack up right away. I don't know why. Maybe pride. Maybe stupidity. But I started being more careful. I kept the shotgun close. I moved the cot so I could see the front door and one of the windows at the same time. I stopped going out after dark. I only cooked during the day. I even started sleeping in short shifts so I wouldn't be caught off guard. But things kept happening. Once, I found the lid to my water container unscrewed. Not spilled, just unscrewed. Another time, the firewood I stacked neatly beside the cabin was scattered in the morning, like someone had kicked through it. One morning, I woke up and found a small bundle of sticks tied together with string, left right on the front step. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a while. Then I picked it up with gloves, walked half a mile into the woods, and tossed it as far as I could. The next night, another one was left in the same spot. That was when I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I was being watched, maybe even stalked. Whoever it was, they knew the woods better than me. They never left obvious signs, just enough to let me know they were there. I started planning my departure. I packed up the things I didn't need, loaded them into the truck. I figured I'd stay one more night, then leave at dawn. That final night, everything came to a head. It was around 2 a.m. I was lying in the dark, Scout at my feet, the shotgun beside me. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, creaking. The boards groaned one at a time. Then silence. Scout growled. A low, deep rumble in his chest. I sat up, holding the shotgun. I didn't speak. I didn't move. Then something brushed against the wall outside. A dragging noise, like a hand sliding across the wood. Then a tap on the window. Not a knock. Tap, light, deliberate. Scout was growling louder now, teeth bared, body shaking. I stood up and moved toward the window, heart pounding. I didn't look out. I just waited. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly. It rattled once, then stopped. I raised the shotgun and shouted. Not with words, just a loud yell. A threat. A warning. Silence. Then footsteps again. Moving away. I waited 10 minutes before I opened the door. No one there, but just off the porch in the dirt were more footprints.
Bora.
Dirty, leading into the woods. That was it. At dawn, I packed the last of my things, loaded Scout into the truck, and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, until I got to a diner 20 miles south. I sat there for an hour with a cold cup of coffee in front of me, Scout sleeping under the table. I never went back to the cabin. A month later, I sold the land. I don't know who or what was out there, but I believe it was human. Some person living off the grid or something worse. Someone who knew I was there, who watched, who waited, who maybe wanted me gone, or dead. And the scariest part wasn't what they did. It was how quiet they were, how patient. They didn't try to break in. They didn't attack. They just let me know / I wasn't alone. That was enough. I still think about it sometimes, about what might have happened if I stayed longer, or opened the door that night, or fell asleep without locking it. Scout's older now, slower, but he's still alert when we go into the woods, still watches the trees. I don't camp alone anymore, and I never go north of Amasa, ever. I was 32 that year, and I had just come off a long stretch of night shifts working security at a distribution center outside Sheffield. It had been a hard few months. The shifts were draining, the pay was average, and I'd been dealing with a breakup that still had my head messed up. We'd been living together for 2 years, and when she left, it was like the whole flat went cold. Every room felt quieter. There were nights I didn't even bother turning the lights on. Just ate a sandwich in the dark and went to bed. By March, I needed to get away from everything. I didn't want to see friends. I didn't want to scroll through messages or check social media. I wanted space, real space, a week away in some quiet place where I didn't have to talk to anyone. I looked online and found a small cabin listed on a lesser-known rental site. It was deep in the countryside outside a village called Royston, not far from Barnsley. The pictures looked rough. Weathered wooden walls, basic furniture, no TV, no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, just what I was looking for. There was an old cast iron stove and a shed out back. The land around it was half woods, half overgrown field. I booked it for 10 days. When I arrived, it was raining. Just that steady, cold British drizzle that makes everything look grayer than it already is. The road leading to the cabin wasn't paved, just a muddy, winding track through bare trees. I drove a rented hatchback that bottomed out twice going over dips in the road. The cabin was even more run down than the pictures. The wood was dark with years of water staining, and there were moss patches growing on the lower walls. The front steps sagged under my weight when I walked up. The lock was stiff. Inside, it smelled of wet wood and ash. I wasn't expecting comfort, but something about how silent it was inside put me off. Still, I unpacked my bag and put away the groceries I brought. A few cans, pasta, bread, eggs, butter, tea. There was a little gas ring for cooking and the stove in the corner for heat. The rain kept tapping the windows while I got the fire going, and by nightfall, the place was just warm enough to stop seeing my breath. The first 2 days were fine. I read a book I'd been putting off for months, walked the edge of the property, and sat out under the tin awning at the back with tea in the afternoons. There were woods maybe 100 yards off, and beyond that, a line of fencing that seemed to mark the edge of the land. A few times I thought I saw movement between the trees, but it was just deer or birds, nothing strange. The shed out back was padlocked. I hadn't noticed that in the listing photos. It looked old, with a corrugated metal roof and rotting wooden sides. Moss and ivy had taken over one corner. The padlock looked newer than the door itself, like someone had recently started locking it. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured it belonged to the owner and had old tools or junk inside. On the third night, I was woken by a noise. It was around 3 a.m., and the fire had long gone out. I remember the sound clearly. It wasn't the wind, which had been blowing gently all night. This was a sharp tapping. 3 times. A pause. Then 3 more, like someone tapping wood with something hard. It sounded like it was coming from behind the cabin. I sat up and stayed still, heart pounding. The only light came from the dying embers in the stove. I didn't move for a while, just listened. After a minute, it stopped. The next morning, I walked around the back. The shed stood the same as before, untouched. The ground was wet and soft, and I looked for footprints, but there was nothing clear, just rain-splashed mud. That day, I felt uneasy. The stillness that had felt peaceful before now felt unnatural. I realized I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived.
No walkers.
No distant cars. Not even a plane overhead. It was like the world stopped outside that patch of land. Later that evening, I walked to the edge of the woods, partly to clear my head, partly because I needed to stretch my legs. The ground there was thick with wet leaves and old branches. I circled back around toward the shed, planning to just walk past it and go back inside. But when I got close, I saw something that made my skin go cold. The lock on the shed door was hanging open. Not broken, not cut, just hanging there, unlatched. I stopped. I knew I hadn't touched it. I stood there for a long time, maybe a full minute, just staring. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two. It was dark inside, and I couldn't see anything past the opening. I didn't go in. I backed away and went inside the cabin. I bolted the door and sat by the fire until it got late. That night, the tapping came back. This time it was louder, not from behind the cabin, but to the side. Near the kitchen window, came again 3 taps. Pause. 3 more, then silence. I didn't move from the chair. I didn't look outside. I just sat there in the dim firelight, eyes fixed on the wall. The next morning, I walked around the cabin again. I checked the shed. The padlock was back in place. It made no sense. From then on, things kept happening. I found muddy prints on the wooden steps. Thin prints smaller than mine. Not boot marks, bare feet. Inside, things began to feel off. My bag was slightly moved one day. A tin of food was sitting on the table, though I was sure I hadn't taken it out. I started hearing what sounded like slow footsteps on the porch at night. I told myself it was animals, wind, my own nerves, but deep down, I knew someone was around. On the 7th night, I woke up and smelled something. It wasn't smoke or mold. It was sweet, like perfume, but old, dusty, faint. I got up slowly. The fire was out again. I didn't light it. I just stood there in the dark, breathing slowly. That smell, it was near the door. When I got close, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A long scratch on the inside of the door, like someone had dragged a nail down it. The wood was fresh, not old. The scratch wasn't there before. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with a flashlight, holding a rusted fire poker from beside the stove. I kept the light off, only turning it on when I heard something. Once, I thought I heard soft breathing outside the window. Another time, a whisper of movement just beyond the wall. The next morning, I opened the shed. I don't know what got into me. Maybe I was too tired to care anymore. Maybe I needed answers. I took a stone and broke the lock. Inside was a mess of old tools, ropes, a rusted wheelbarrow, moldy sacks. But one thing stood out: a mattress, dirty, damp, curled in the corner like someone had been sleeping on it. Beside it, a coat, a woman's coat. I stepped back fast, nearly slipped on the wet floor. When I turned to leave, I saw something scratched into the inside of the shed door. Just one word: stay. I left it all behind. I didn't pack. I didn't shut the windows or clean up. I grabbed my keys and drove down the muddy track without even checking the mirrors. The road was slick, and I almost got stuck near the bend, but I kept going. I drove straight to Barnsley and booked a room at a cheap hotel. I didn't care what it cost. I never went back. I emailed the owner the next day saying I left early due to a family emergency. Never got a reply. A few weeks later, I read a local story online about a woman who had escaped a psychiatric unit a year earlier. She had been seen squatting in old barns and sheds across South Yorkshire, always moving, always hiding. The last confirmed sighting was near Royston. The article had a photo. It was her. Same coat, same face, thin, pale, hollow eyes. No one knows where she is now. Maybe she moved on. Maybe she's still out there, sleeping in someone's shed, walking barefoot through the woods. But sometimes, even now, when I can't sleep, I think about that tapping. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more, and I wonder how long she stood there, just outside waiting.